The autumn assembly at Thornfield Park had been arranged for one purpose, and every family of consequence in the county knew it. Lady Constance Ashworth, the Dowager Countess of Thornfield, stood at the center of the receiving line in black silk and garnets, her chin lifted to its habitual angle, her gloved hand resting on the arm of Mr. Philip Cathcart, her nephew, the man she had chosen to inherit the estate the law had not yet granted him. The ballroom smelled of beeswax and late chrysanthemums. 40 candles burned in the chandelier above the parquet floor where the county's daughters were meant to dance, and Eliza Fenwick stood against the far wall in her dove-gray gown, the one with the mended sleeve, holding a glass of lemonade she had not been offered but had poured for herself, because no one had remembered she was there. She was 23 years old. Her father had been steward of Thornfield for 19 years, and he had died 8 months ago in the room above the kitchen where Eliza now slept, leaving her nothing except the right to remain in the house on the Dowager Countess's charity. That charity had a sound. It sounded like Lady Constance's voice carrying across the hall to Mrs. Pelling, the vicar's wife, loud enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear. "Miss Fenwick is our companion, of course, the steward's girl. We keep her until she finds a situation." The words landed on the parquet and did not bounce. Eliza's hand tightened on the glass. Her face did not change. She had learned, in 8 months of this, that her face was the only currency she still controlled, and she spent it carefully. Across the room, past the dancers and the chrysanthemums, and the vicar's wife's visible pity, a man Eliza did not recognize stood near the doorway with his arms at his sides. He was tall. His coat was good wool, not new, and it sat on his shoulders the way coats sit on men who work with their bodies rather than their tailors. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was still, and his eyes were the color of winter river water. And they were fixed on Eliza Fenwick with an attention so specific that if she had turned to look, she would have seen it the way one sees a flame across a dark field. She did not turn. He did not move. His hand went to his chest, briefly, pressing something beneath the wool of his coat, and then dropped to his side. The gesture was small enough that no one in the ballroom would have noted it, and yet it carried the weight of something practiced, something habitual, something that lived closer to grief than to fashion. The assembly continued around them, and the candles burned, and the chrysanthemums released their last autumn sweetness into the warm air, and neither of them knew what the other's name was, and both of them had lost a parent inside the walls of this house. If you have ever watched someone stand perfectly still in a room that has decided she does not matter and felt the slow pull in your chest that says stay, then you know already where this story is going. Hold that feeling. It will be earned. Eliza's days at Thornfield followed a pattern she had not designed and could not alter. She rose at 6 and dressed in the half-dark of the room above the kitchen, the room that had been her father's study and still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, though his pipes had been packed into a box and placed in the attic within a week of his burial. She brushed her hair and pinned it, and went down the back stairs to the small parlor where Lady Constance took her morning chocolate. And she sat in the straight-backed chair beside the window and read aloud from whichever novel the Dowager Countess had selected, which was always a novel about a woman of rank who married well and was rewarded for it. At 9, she sorted correspondence. At 11, she walked the long gallery with Lady Constance, whose hip troubled her in damp weather, and listened to instructions about the household that were delivered as observations about Eliza's inadequacy. "Your father would have known to order the linen before Michaelmas, Miss Fenwick. You have not his head for these things." At 1, she ate alone in the morning room, while the Dowager Countess lunched with Philip Cathcart, whose laugh carried through the door like the sound of a man who already owned the silver he was eating from. The estate had been without a rightful earl for 2 years, since the death of the old Lord Thornfield, who had left no son, and whose younger brother, long estranged, had died before him. The title and the land were tangled in a legal silence that the Dowager Countess filled with Philip's ambition and her own certainty. Philip himself was a man of 30, fair-haired, with a pleasant face, and a habit of standing too close when he spoke. He had begun, in recent weeks, to stand too close to Eliza. "You know," he said one morning, finding her alone in the corridor outside the linen closet, "your position here is not permanent. My aunt keeps you from kindness, Miss Fenwick, and kindness has a limit." He paused. She waited. "If you were to marry," he said, his voice carefully reasonable, "your situation would be settled. You would not need to depend on anyone's charity." Eliza looked at him. "I am not depending on charity, Mr. Cathcart. I am earning my keep." He smiled the way men smile when they believe patience is the same as power. "The steward's girl," he said quietly, almost to himself, as if confirming a fact he had been told. "My aunt says you have your father's stubbornness and none of his sense." She heard it land. She did not flinch. She turned and walked back toward the morning room with her hands steady at her sides and her pulse loud in her throat. That same afternoon, Mr. Breverton arrived. He was a solicitor from London, thin and precise, with spectacles that sat low on his nose and a leather case that he held against his chest as though it contained something alive. Lady Constance received him in the drawing room. Eliza was present, because she was always present, the way a clock on a mantel is present, functional and unregarded. Mr. Breverton set the leather case on his knees and opened it. "My lady," he said, "I bring news of some consequence. The rightful heir to the earldom of Thornfield has been located." The room changed temperature. Lady Constance's hand paused on the arm of her chair. Philip Cathcart set down his teacup with a small, definite click. "His name is Henry Ashworth," Mr. Breverton continued. "The son of the late Earl's younger brother, Mr. James Ashworth, and his wife, the former Miss Anne Garrity. He was located 3 weeks ago at the stables of Lord Pemberton's estate in Wiltshire, where he has been employed as a groom for the past 4 years. He is 28 years of age, and he has refused, in writing, to claim the title." The silence after this was a particular kind. It was the silence of a room recalculating. Lady Constance's lips pressed together, then relaxed into something that was not quite a smile. "Then the matter is simple," she said. "If the man will not come, the estate proceeds as it has. Philip." She turned to her nephew. "Have Mr. Breverton shown to his room, and Miss Fenwick." She looked at Eliza. "You will deliver the final papers to this person in Wiltshire. Take the morning coach. It is a task suited to your station." The stables at Pemberton Hall sat behind a long wall of pale limestone, and the yard smelled of hay and horse, and the particular sharp sweetness of autumn rain on stone. Eliza arrived at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, her cloak damp at the shoulders, the solicitor's leather case held carefully under her arm. She had not been to Wiltshire before. The road from Dorset had taken 7 hours by coach and another 40 minutes by hired cart, and she had eaten nothing since a bread roll purchased at the coaching inn at dawn, and her feet in their worn half-boots were cold from the wet ground, and she was aware of all of this the way one is aware of familiar discomfort, which is to say she noted it, and continued. A boy of perhaps 12 pointed her toward the far end of the stable block. She walked the length of the yard, past a bay mare tied to a post, past a water trough, past a stack of fresh-cut timber, and found a man standing inside the last stall with his back to her, running a brush along the flank of a gray gelding. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. His forearms were brown from weather. His hands moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a person who had done this particular thing 10,000 times and still found it worth doing carefully. "Mr. Ashworth," Eliza said. He turned. She saw his face for the first time without the distance of a ballroom between them, and she knew, with the certainty that arrives in the body before the mind can account for it, that this was the man who had stood near the doorway at the assembly. The same stillness, the same careful river-colored eyes. He looked at her. He looked at the leather case. He looked at her again. "You have come from Thornfield," he said. It was not a question. "I have brought papers from Mr. Breverton, the solicitor," Eliza said, "regarding the earldom." She held out the case. He did not take it. "I have written my answer to Mr. Breverton twice," he said. "The answer has not changed." "I understand," Eliza said. "I was asked to deliver them in person." "By whom?" "Lady Constance." Something moved behind his eyes, too quick to name. He took the case from her hands, set it on the stall door without opening it, and looked at her standing in the cold with her damp cloak and her careful posture, and her chin held at an angle that did not ask for sympathy. "Come inside," he said. "There is tea." "I am quite well, thank you." "You are not. Your hands are white. Come inside." She did not move. He said nothing further. He walked past her toward the small office at the end of the block, and something in the quality of his not waiting, the way he left the door open without turning to see if she followed, made her follow. The office was warm and plain. A stove in the corner. A deal table with a ledger open on it. 2 wooden chairs. He poured tea into a tin cup and set it before her without ceremony. She wrapped her hands around it and felt the heat move through her fingers like a returning language. He sat across from her and watched her drink, and his watching was not the watching of a man who is being polite. It was the watching of a man who is cataloging the worn cuffs of her gloves, the careful way she held the cup, as though she had been taught to hold fine china and could not unlearn the habit even with tin. The fact that she had not complained about the cold, or the journey, or the errand, or the smallness of the chair. He noticed all of it, and his face gave nothing back, and the room was quiet except for the sound of the gelding shifting in his stall and the rain beginning again on the limestone roof. "Why does the Dowager Countess send her companion to do a solicitor's errand?" he asked. Eliza set down the cup. "Because she considers the errand beneath a solicitor's time, and I am the nearest person of lesser consequence." His jaw tightened. A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. "Why do you stay at Thornfield?" "Because I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Ashworth." She said it without self-pity, without performance, the way one states altitude above sea level. He looked at her for a long time after that. The gelding shifted in the stall behind them, and a pigeon landed on the roof with a soft, settling sound, and neither of them spoke. Eliza returned to Thornfield 2 days later with the papers unsigned and the knowledge, carried like a stone in her chest, that the rightful Earl of Thornfield was a man who groomed horses with the care of someone who understood that gentleness toward a creature that cannot advocate for itself is not weakness. Lady Constance received the news with satisfaction. "As I expected," she said. "The man is his father's son. No sense of duty, no feeling for the name." She turned to Philip. "We proceed." Philip's confidence swelled. He began to appear at dinner in the old Earl's chair, which Lady Constance had not corrected, and to give instructions to the footman in a voice pitched for ownership. He began to refer to the tenants as though they already owed him their rents, and he began, with increasing frequency, to find Eliza alone. He was never improper. He was simply there, always at her elbow, always offering what he called kindness, and what felt to Eliza like the slow closing of a door. The household prepared for the harvest supper, The annual gathering of tenants and county families at Thornfield Park. Lady Constance intended to use the occasion to present Philip formally as the future master. Invitations were sent, the silver was polished, and on the evening of the supper itself, with the long table set in the great hall, and the candles lit, and the tenants filing in with their cleaned boots and their best coats, Lady Constance stood at the head of the table and spoke. "Thornfield has been without its master for too long," she said. "The late Earl's nephew, his true heir by law, has been found and has declined the honor. We shall not mourn his absence. This house has a future, and his name is Mr. Philip Cathcart." She turned and gestured, and the room followed her hand. And then she added, with the particular clarity of a woman accustomed to being heard, "Miss Fenwick, do sit down. The steward's girl ought not to hover when there is a proper announcement being made." 40 pairs of eyes moved to Eliza. She was standing near the sideboard, holding a tray of glasses she had been distributing because the footman was ill, and someone had to do it. The tray did not shake. Her face did not change. She sat. What none of those 40 pairs of eyes saw was the man standing in the shadow of the servants' corridor, 2 steps from the door to the great hall, who had arrived that afternoon on the pretext of delivering a horse Lord Pemberton had sold to the estate. Henry Ashworth saw Eliza sit. He saw the stillness of her hands. He saw the way the room turned from her as easily as it had turned toward her, because she was functional and therefore invisible, and he stood in the dark corridor and did not move. He had seen something else that afternoon, before the supper, before the candles were lit. He had been crossing the stable yard when he heard a voice he did not recognize, raised in a tone he recognized intimately. It was Lady Constance's voice, coming from the housekeeper's parlor, and the words were addressed to Mrs. Lyle, the old housekeeper, the woman who had served Thornfield for 31 years, who had known Henry's mother, who still kept lavender in the linen cupboards, because Anne Ashworth had planted it in the kitchen garden the year she arrived as a bride. "You will not speak of that woman again in this house, Mrs. Lyle. She was nothing. Her son is nothing. And if you cannot remember that, you may find another situation." Then a second voice. Quiet. Certain. Eliza's voice. "Mrs. Lyle has served this house for 31 years, Lady Constance. She was here before you were. She stays." The silence after that was the sound of a woman who had gambled her only coin on a principle she could not afford. Henry stood in the corridor and heard it. He did not announce himself. He turned and walked back to the stable yard and stood with his hand on the neck of the horse he had brought, and breathed until his breathing was even again. 3 days after the harvest supper, Henry was still at Thornfield. He had not explained why to anyone, and no one had asked, because a groom delivering a horse was beneath the notice of the family he was meant to inherit. Eliza found him in the library on a Tuesday morning, standing before the portrait of a young woman in a pale green gown, with a spray of lavender pinned to her bodice. The portrait hung above the cold hearth in a room the Dowager Countess rarely entered, because the Dowager Countess preferred the new drawing room and its proximity to the terrace. Eliza had come to find a book of household accounts her father had kept, and instead she found Henry, standing very still with his hand at his chest, pressing something beneath his shirt. "Mr. Ashworth," she said. He did not startle. He turned slowly, and his hand dropped to his side, and his face was the face of a man who had been caught in a room he was not ready to explain. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, nodding towards the portrait. Eliza looked at the painting. The woman was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair and steady eyes, and a mouth that suggested she laughed easily and meant it when she did. "I do not," Eliza said. "Anne Garrity," he said, "before she married James Ashworth, before the family refused to receive her, before they struck her husband's name from the register and let her live on nothing." He paused. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this calm for years. She was my mother. Eliza did not speak. She stood and listened, and her listening was the kind that holds space without filling it. She died 6 years ago, Henry said, in a rented room in Bath. The room was cold, and the blankets were thin, and she had sold her jewelry 2 winters before, all except one thing. He reached beneath his shirt and drew out a cord. On it hung a plain gold ring, worn smooth at the band, too small for any of his fingers. Her wedding ring, he said. She asked me to keep it when she could no longer wear it. I was 22. I held her hand in that room, and I promised her I would never go back to the family that had let her die. His voice did not break. It simply stopped, the way a river stops at a dam, and everything it carried was held behind the silence. Eliza looked at the ring. She looked at the portrait. She looked at the man standing between them, and she understood, with a clarity that hurt, why the stables of a stranger's estate were more bearable to him than the halls of his own inheritance. "She looks kind," Eliza said. "She was," Henry said. "She was the kindest person I have ever known, and this house killed her." He put the ring back beneath his shirt. His hand stayed at his chest for a moment longer than it needed to. Then he looked at Eliza, and whatever he saw in her face made something shift behind his eyes. A fracture in the stillness, a crack in the frozen surface of a river that had been still for 6 years. "Walk with me," he said. It was a command. She heard only the command. She did not hear what the audience heard, which was the voice of a man who had just shown the inside of his chest to a woman he had known for a fortnight, and who needed, with an urgency he could not name, for the next minutes to contain her presence, and nothing else. They walked the East Garden in silence. The lavender was past its season, the stalks dry and silver and fragrant in the way that dead lavender is fragrant, which is to say honestly. Henry stopped beside a low stone wall and rested his hand on it, and Eliza stood 2 steps away, and the distance between them was the most specific distance she had ever been aware of. She could feel the warmth of him in the air between them, the way one feels a hearth from across a room. Her pulse climbed. Her hand found the edge of the wall and held it, and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her. And the silence was full of everything neither of them was ready to say. She heard the protection inside it only later, lying awake in the room above the kitchen, replaying the sound of his voice in the library, with her hand pressed to the warmth at her collarbone, where no ring hung. If this story is beginning to gather in your chest, if you are waiting for the moment when his careful stillness and her quiet worth finally meet in the same sentence, stay close. The moment is coming. The following week, Lady Constance summoned Eliza to the drawing room and closed the door. Philip Cathcart stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and the set of his shoulders suggested a speech had been prepared. "Miss Fenwick," Lady Constance said, "you are aware that your position in this house exists at my pleasure." "I am, Lady Constance." "Then you are aware that my pleasure has conditions." She paused. She smoothed the front of her gown, a gesture so deliberate it functioned as punctuation. "Mr. Cathcart has made you an offer. I am told you have declined it. I am telling you now that declining was not among your choices." The room was very still. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire in the grate had been built too high, and the heat pressed against Eliza's face like a hand. "I cannot marry Mr. Cathcart, Lady Constance." "You can and you will. The banns will be read on Sunday. The wedding will take place before Christmas, and you will move to the East Wing, where you will be comfortable and quiet. and you will not trouble this household with your opinions again." Eliza's hands were in her lap. She looked at them. The knuckles were reddened from the cold water she used to wash the linens because the laundry maid had been dismissed and no replacement had been hired. She looked at Philip. He had the expression of a man receiving a gift he had been promised. "And if I refuse?" Eliza said. "Then you leave Thornfield tomorrow morning without reference, without your father's belongings, and without the 40 pounds this household owes you for your service." "The steward's girl," Lady Constance said, and the words were carved and polished and placed like stones on a grave. "Will find that the world outside these walls is less generous than the world within them." Eliza did not answer. There was nothing to answer with. She looked at the fire that had been built too high in a room she had cleaned and stocked and tended for 8 months, in a house where her father had given 19 years of his life, and she felt the door closing, and she let it close, because a door that closes on a command you cannot obey is not a door you were ever meant to walk through. That evening, Eliza's things were moved from the room above the kitchen to a smaller room at the end of the servants' corridor, a room with no window, and a cot and a single hook on the wall for her cloak. Her father's books were packed into crates and carried to the cellar. The miniature portrait of her mother, which had sat on her father's desk for 19 years, was placed in a box with the pipes and the account ledgers and the small collection of pressed flowers her father had gathered from the gardens each spring. She asked for the miniature. She was told it belonged to the household. She was given a week. In the kitchen the next morning, Eliza heard the scullery maid, a girl called Prue, whisper to the cook as she passed. "Lady Constance says the steward's girl has forgotten herself, says she needs marrying or turning out, and it will be won by Sunday." Eliza stopped in the doorway. The words hung in the air like lamp smoke. She walked through them and kept walking. Henry was gone. He had left Thornfield after the library, after the portrait, after the walk she had taken with him through the East Garden, where the lavender grew wild, and he had stopped and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She did not know where he had gone. She did not expect him to return. She had nothing left at Thornfield except a week and a principal, and principals do not pay coach fare. She went to him. It took her a full day. She sold her mother's garnet earrings to the jeweler in the village for enough to hire a cart to the coaching inn and a seat on the mail coach to Wiltshire, and she arrived at Pemberton Hall at dusk, with no luggage and no plan beyond the knowledge that there was one person in the world who had looked at her as though looking at her was not an act of charity, and he was here, and she had something to say to him. She found him in the stable yard, mending a bridle by lamplight. His hands were steady on the leather. He looked up when she came through the gate, and his hand stopped. "Miss Fenwick?" "Mr. Ashworth." She stood in the yard in the fading light with her thin cloak and her worn boots and the particular stillness of a woman who has spent all her currency except the truth. "I am not here to ask you to save me," she said. "Lady Constance has arranged my marriage to Mr. Cathcart. I have refused. I will be gone from Thornfield by Sunday. That is my affair, and I did not come to make it yours." He set down the bridle. He stood. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply closer. "Then why have you come?" he asked, and his voice was low and careful, and held like breath at the lip of a glass. "Because you are wrong about Thornfield," she said. "Not about what they did to your mother. That was unforgivable, and I will not ask you to forgive it. You are wrong about what Thornfield is now. Mrs. Lyle keeps lavender in the linen cupboards because your mother planted it. The tenants speak of your father with respect, Mr. Ashworth, real respect, because he treated them well when he lived there. There are people in that house, and on that land, who remember what your family was before the cruelty, and they deserve someone who understands what was lost." She paused. Her breath was uneven. The lamplight caught the edge of her jaw, and the damp at her temple, and the small, fierce steadiness of her eyes. "Thornfield was your mother's home," she said. "Come home." The word landed between them like a key dropped on stone. Henry looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. His hand moved to his chest, to the cord beneath his shirt, and pressed. "You walked away from everything they offered you," he said. "You sold something to get here. I can see it in your face." "My mother's earrings." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the river had cracked. Not shattered, not broken apart, simply cracked, a single line of warmth running through the stillness like the first sign of a thaw that has been 6 years coming. "Go back to Thornfield," he said. "Tell no one you came here." "Mr. Ashworth." "Go back," he said. "I will come." She looked at him. She looked at the cord at his throat, and the lamp behind him, and the dark stable yard, and the bridle he had set down to stand for her. She nodded. She turned and walked to the gate. And she did not look back. And he stood in the yard and watched her go, and did not move until the sound of her footsteps had faded entirely. The autumn assembly at Thornfield Park was held for the second time that season, and this time the Dowager Countess had made certain the occasion would serve its purpose. The ballroom was lit with twice the usual number of candles. A string quartet played from the gallery above. The county's families had been summoned with invitations that carried the Ashworth crest, which Lady Constance had continued to use despite having no legal authority to do so, and the guests arrived in their best silks and their careful smiles and their willingness to witness whatever was about to be announced. Philip Cathcart stood at Lady Constance's right hand in a new coat, his hair oiled, his expression the expression of a man who has been told the prize is already his. Eliza stood near the far wall. She wore the dove-gray gown with the mended sleeve. She had not been invited. She had not been forbidden. She existed in the narrow space between those two things, which was the space she had occupied for 8 months. And she stood in it now, with her hands clasped, and her face still, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened at 8:15. The quartet faltered and recovered. A man walked in. He wore a dark coat, well-fitted, that Eliza had not seen before. His hair had been cut. His boots were polished. His posture carried the particular authority of a man who has decided to claim what he has been refusing, and the room felt the decision before it understood it. Mr. Breverton walked 2 steps behind him, carrying the leather case. Henry Ashworth crossed the threshold of the ballroom where his mother had once danced, and where Eliza Fenwick had once been told she did not matter. And the room went silent, the way a room goes silent when it recognizes that the weather has changed. Lady Constance's face did not move. Her hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Philip Cathcart took 1 step back and then stopped, because there was nowhere to step back to. Mr. Breverton spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the dry precision of a man who had waited 2 years for this moment and intended to use it correctly. "I present Lord Henry Ashworth, son of the late Mr. James Ashworth and his wife, Anne, the rightful Earl of Thornfield. His claim has been verified by the courts. The documents are sealed." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a room rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. Henry walked forward. He did not look at Lady Constance. He did not look at Philip. He walked the length of the ballroom, past the candles and the chrysanthemums and the string quartet that had stopped playing, and he stopped in front of Eliza Fenwick, who was standing against the far wall in her dove-gray gown, with her hands clasped and her pulse visible at her throat. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room held its breath. "I claim Thornfield," he said, his voice level and clear. and I claim Miss Fenwick." 8 words. They landed in the silence like a seal pressed into warm wax, and they did not move. Lady Constance opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. And what came out was not the polished, hierarchy-protecting sentence she had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was a fragment. "You cannot." "It is done, Lady Constance," Mr. Breverton said quietly. "The Earl's claim is absolute. The Dower House has been prepared for your use." Philip Cathcart's face lost its color in stages, like a canvas left in rain. He looked at Lady Constance. She did not look at him. Mrs. Lyle, who had been standing near the servants' door with her hands folded and her eyes bright, pressed her fingers to her lips and nodded once, a small private gesture that no one in the ballroom saw except Eliza. The vicar's wife touched her husband's arm. The tenant farmer Mr. Grieve, who had known James Ashworth and remembered him as a man who checked the fences himself, straightened in his chair and looked at Henry with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something correct to happen and has finally been rewarded for his patience. Henry extended his hand. Eliza looked at it. She looked at his face, at the stillness that had cracked and the warmth that ran through the crack like light through a seam in a curtain, and she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. They were warm and rough and steady. December came to Thornfield like an exhale. Snow fell on the east garden and covered the lavender, which would sleep until spring and return, as it had returned every year since Anne Ashworth planted it. The Dowager Countess had removed to the Dower House at the end of the lane with her garnet jewelry and her pride, and a silence that was, if not peace, at least the beginning of something that might someday resemble it. Philip Cathcart had returned to London without farewell. Mr. Breverton had filed the final documents and taken the morning coach home with his leather case empty and his spectacles cleaned and a satisfaction he would not have called happiness, because solicitors do not use that word, though they sometimes feel the shape of it. Mrs. Lyle had placed fresh lavender in every linen cupboard in the house, and when Eliza asked her why, she had said only, "Because it is time." Eliza sat at the piano in the drawing-room on a Sunday evening in early December, with a fire in the grate and the snow falling past the tall windows, and a silence in the house that was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of a house that had remembered what it was for. Her father's books had been returned from the cellar. The miniature of her mother sat on the mantelpiece beside a small vase of dried lavender that Mrs. Lyle had placed there without being asked. Eliza played a piece her father had loved, a slow air in a minor key that resolved, as all the best minor key pieces do, into something warm and plain and settled. Her fingers moved across the keys with the sureness of a woman who had been taught music by a father who believed that beauty was not a luxury reserved for those who could afford it, and who had been right. Henry stood in the doorway and listened. He did not announce himself. He watched her hands on the keys and her straight back and the firelight on her hair, and something in his chest. The thing that had been frozen for 6 years and cracked in a stable yard and broken open in a ballroom settled into a quiet that was not stillness. It was peace. He waited until she reached the final measure and her hand stilled on the keys, and then he crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench. And the bench was narrow and his shoulder was warm against hers, and neither of them moved away. He reached into his coat and brought out something small. A ring. Not on a cord this time. It had been set into a proper band, the gold polished, the fit sized for a woman's hand. His mother's wedding ring. He set it on the piano beside her left hand, among the keys, and he did not explain it. Because it did not need explaining. Eliza looked at the ring. She looked at the man beside her, sighed. She picked it up and held it. And it was warm from his pocket. And outside, the snow continued to fall on the garden where the lavender slept. And inside, the fire burned, and the piano held its last note like a breath released after a long, long waiting. She put the ring on. It fit. If Eliza's journey moved you, if you felt the moment when his stillness finally broke and her worth was finally named in the room where it had been denied, thank you for staying until the end. Leave a quiet word if you like, and come back when you need to be reminded that the world's first verdict is not always its last.